Welcome back to another deep dive on the Explainer. Today we are jumping straight into the year 632 AD, right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. We're looking at a period of history that completely redrew the map of the world in an impossibly short amount of time. Okay, let's dive into this. This is the central historical mystery we're unraveling today. We are looking at an underdog to empire narrative that truly defies logic. How on earth did a newly unified desert society erupt from the Arabian Peninsula and completely dismantle the ancient, deeply entrenched superpowers of Rome and Persia? And all of that in just a single decade? Part 1. The Orthodox Caliphs, the Patriarchal Age. Now, to understand this massive expansion, we really have to look at the new leadership. When Prophet Muhammad died, he left no male heir. So instead of relying on the hereditary bloodlines that defined the rival empires of Byzantium and Persia, leadership passed to his closest companions, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. This became an elective office based heavily on tribal seniority and, of course, proximity to the Prophet. It was a totally different way of transferring power compared to the monolithic empires they bordered. And this visually anchors us in what actually brought them together, the Kaaba in Mecca, the spiritual center. You see, this new state wasn't just your standard tribal alliance. It was a community, an ummah, bound by faith, not just blood. Religion was the bedrock of this new social organization, which was a first in the history of Arabia. What's really wild is how these early leaders lived. Abu Bakr, the very first caliph, lived in what the texts call patriarchal simplicity. He was literally conducting state business right in the courtyard of the Prophet's mosque in Medina. No grand palaces, no royal courts. It's a stark, almost unbelievable contrast between the frugal, unostentatious lifestyles of these early caliphs and the immense, unimaginable wealth of the empires they were about to conquer. Part 2. Consolidating the home front, the Ridda Wars. Now, what's really interesting about this is how easily the whole movement could have just collapsed. Right after the Prophet's death, the old tribal divisions flared up again. A lot of tribes across Arabia decided they didn't want to pay taxes or be tied to Medina anymore. This sparked the Ridda or apostasy wars. The centrifugal forces of Arabian tribal life were literally threatening to tear this brand new state apart at the seams. The crisis demanded absolute, decisive action, and it arrived in the form of General Khalid ibn al-Walid, famously known as the Sword of Allah. Through sheer military genius, he brought these rebellious tribes into submission in just 6 months. And this was a game changer. It didn't just save the state, it transformed the entire Arabian Peninsula into a consolidated armed camp. They essentially became this mighty reservoir of nomadic energy, ready to overflow into the surrounding lands.
Part 3. The Conquest of Syria and the Fall of Yarmouk.
Let's map out how quickly this builds. The Arabian armies just hurled themselves directly against the Byzantine superpower to the north, and the speed was absolutely shocking. In 634 AD, Khalid makes this legendary, forced waterless march across the desert to surprise Byzantine defenses. By 635, the great metropolis of Damascus surrenders, and that sets the stage perfectly for the defining clash in 636. And that brings us to August 20, 636 AD. Imagine this, an incredibly hot, dust-blown day in the Yarmouk Valley. The Arab forces are facing off against the massive imperial army of Emperor Heraclius. Under the cover of this blinding, wind-blown dust, the Byzantine troops were relentlessly driven into a steep riverbed. The imperial army literally dissolved into a fleeing, panic-stricken mob. This single massive victory sealed the fate of Syria, leading quickly to the surrender of major cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, and Antioch. The defeat was so total, so absolute, that the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, as he was abandoning one of the fairest provinces of the Eastern Empire forever, famously looked back and said, "Farewell, O Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy." That is a heavy historical statement. But here's the surprise twist in our explainer today. The local Semitic populations in Syria, they actually welcomed the new Arab conquerors. Why? Well, Byzantine rule had been incredibly oppressive. The native populations resented the heavy Roman taxation. They felt deep racial antipathy toward their Greek rulers, and they were just exhausted by the sectarian religious friction imposed by Constantinople. To them, the Arab conquerors looked like a much lighter, far more tolerant administration. Part 4. Toppling the Persian giant, Al-Qadisiyah. With Syria falling, the narrative pivots eastward to the Sassanid Empire of Persia. In 637 AD, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, Commander Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas basically repeated the success of Syria. On another extremely hot, dusty day, the massive Sassanid army dissolved in panic. And they kept going. They captured the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, where these desert nomads were suddenly staring at unimaginable luxuries, like the legendary king's spring carpet, which was made entirely of silk and precious stones. By 641, the final collapse happened at Nahawand, pushing the Arab frontier all the way to the borders of India.
Part 5. Egypt, expanding to the greenery.
They didn't stop there either. They made a highly strategic push further west. Recognizing how incredibly valuable the Nile Valley was, Commander Umar ibn al-As launched a daring expedition. By 640 AD, he completely routed the remaining Byzantine forces at the fortress of Babylon. This was huge. It secured the gateway to Alexandria, capturing one of the most vital commercial hubs and agricultural granaries of the entire ancient world.
Part 6. How the Arabs won.
So the crucial point is, how did they actually pull this off? The historical sources point to 3 main pillars for this unprecedented success. First, economic necessity. The sheer hunger and want of the desert tribes drove them to seek out the fertile lands of their neighbors. Second, intense religious fervor. The promise of paradise gave them unbelievably high morale and a unified battle cry. And third, superior mobility. The Arab armies used advanced camelry and cavalry tactics to completely master open space warfare, completely outmaneuvering the heavy, static armies of Rome and Persia.
It's an unbelievable story of timing, tactics, and transformation. But it leaves us with an absolutely massive problem for the next chapter. Once you burst out of the desert and conquer the known world in a single generation, how on earth do you govern it? That is a massive administrative puzzle, and it's exactly what we'll be exploring next time. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer.